Another thing that conflict profiteers do, as I was saying before, is they find um, issues that divide rather than unite society. Not just, for example, the issue of abortions. My personal opinion is abortions are not a good thing, but that it should be ultimately the right and the decision of that woman whether or not she brings to life somebody. Because if her rights are not protected, then nobody's rights are. Everybody's right to their privacy has to be respected. Laws pertain to individual persons and not to dependent living organisms, for very logical reasons. But anyway, they conflict profiteers. Profiteers. They like to find divisive issues. So aside from abortion, for example, they might support the death penalty because they believe that most likely most people who are on death row or who are facing the death penalty are guilty and therefore deserve to die. The argument against the death penalty is very simple. How can we ever be 100% certain that a person hasn't been falsely convicted based on false evidence, or framed, in other words, maybe for political reasons? People should not be put to death because they might be innocent, and once you kill them, you can't bring them back. And ultimately, because that death penalty is a way to intimidate and to repress people politically. It's a way of saying to people, if you don't behave, you might be accused of something falsely and end up on death row. I oppose the death penalty because it's just not ethical. It's not a good way of solving the problem. Besides, if somebody really is guilty, I'd rather see them suffer in isolation or in prison with others who are criminals than to be either free in society or dead. Dead persons don't suffer. So there's many arguments against the death penalty, but conflict profiteers tend to support the death penalty while they oppose abortions. Interesting. I do believe in free speech, or I should say I think that free speech is the right thing. I don't believe anything, but I think free speech is essential. And to me, free speech doesn't mean that you have a right to go out and start threatening other people's right to free speech. That isn't free speech. And if you say it in private, I don't care. If you say it on your own private farm, you want to have a rally of a bunch of racists on your own private land, and you want to say all you want about how you want to hurt other people, do it. But the moment you're in a public space, you have to self-censor yourself. And in fact, better than that, you should even think about your own values and principles. What is it you're really doing? Because as far as I'm concerned, for example, what makes America great is unity and diversity. And what weakens America is the lack of unity and diversity. People may argue, but wait a second, you're contradicting yourself. If you're saying that in a public space a right-wing extremist who is a Nazi or Ku Klux Klan cannot freely say, I didn't say they cannot. They have to pay for their own security. You might say, but that's like saying in a sense that they can't, because unless they can have the money to pay for their own private security force, otherwise they really can't use the public spaces to speak. But again, who said free speech entitles you to threaten other people? So there's polite, respectful, cautious discussion and freedom of speech in that sense, and then there's threats that are basically the beginning of violence, because the first form of violence is a threat. Not necessarily always. There are people who just will attack you without giving you a warning or without a threat, and that's fairly terrible. But even if you just give a warning, a threat is a threat, and it's wrong. It's not necessary, and it doesn't belong in the public domain. It belongs in your own private space and time. If you hate a certain politician and you want to see them hurt, you can say that in your own private home, in your own private land, in your own private magazine that is only sold to a certain select number of people who want to hear that. And most likely you won't get in any trouble because nobody will know the better who doesn't agree with you. But if you say it in public, you are sending a threat, and you are encouraging other people who may not be as, let's say, normal as you are, supposing that you are normal, and who may take that as encouragement to harm innocent people. So there you are. This is my opinion on freedom of speech, and on conflict profiteers, because you see, there is a connection. Conflict profiteers are against real freedom of speech. They don't mind if rich people who have the money can buy advertising and say what they want through those advertisements, or, paid infomercials. But if you are a private individual without any real money and you want to say something and tell the world about it, they don't want you to do that, because they believe that only people who have money are at all initially qualified to speak freely. They're fascists. That's what conflict profiteers are. They're fascists. They're not for freedom of speech. They are for phony freedom of speech. They will argue that it's freedom of speech to go out and say that the entire religion of a certain people is evil. I think that's very offensive. First of all the major monotheisms have very good intentions, even if they have some problems within them in terms of which things you interpret in which way. They are subject to interpretation, in other words. I can say that you can take all the three major monotheisms and you can interpret them in a non-violent way, or you can interpret them in a violent way. You can say that these stories and maybe myths of things that happened in the past that are written in those religious books are sort of instructions to commit violence in the future. They're not. They're just telling you what happened. So, and to think that God is for violence or for the destruction of people, floods, whatever. I don't buy that myself. And you can say, well, wait a second, you're a Jew. Don't you buy the idea of the great flood and how God promised never to do that again? I don't buy that. I just think that's a misunderstanding of the nature of God, and I don't necessarily think that that's written in stone. I think that's what people believed about God. That doesn't mean that there isn't any God, or that's another issue. You can look at my other videos about what I think about spiritual and religious issues. But conflict profiteers, they love to find issues that divide people and then push those issues into the mainstream media. For example, one of the worst things they do is they love to sell conflict based on, sex. So they like to hyperinflate, especially if they can find something dirty on a left of center, left-wing politician. They love to say this person had this affair with this affair behind this person's back, and therefore they're not qualified to hold public office. I don't agree. People can have affairs and their wives might even approve of it secretly, and once they're embarrassed in public, they may disapprove because they're embarrassed. But a lot of people have very unusual ways of living their lives, and they can still be good people. Adult sexual freedoms between consenting adults should not be an issue of anybody's concern, except the people involved. Now, if somebody cheated on their wife, or a woman cheated on her husband, it happens too, and that's not good. That's wrong. But if they did that, that's still a personal matter until some crime takes place. That itself is not necessarily a crime. You can argue, well, yeah, it's a violation of the vows made in a marriage, but vows made in a marriage are not held by the law the same way that people tend to think they are. Those are vows based on religious and personal views, or secular views on issues of marriage. They're not necessarily strict laws. So I believe that people should butt out of people's personal, private lives unless there's an actual evidence of a serious crime. By a serious crime, I mean if you rape somebody, you murder somebody, you attempt to murder somebody, you attempt to rape somebody. If there's serious evidence of that, that's a crime. But you wait for the system, what they call the criminal justice system. I think that's the wrong way to call it. Let's call it the legal system, if that's what it were, and what it should be. You wait for the legal process to prove that somebody is guilty of a certain crime before you start making all kinds of news reports about it. Unfortunately, the conflict profiteers of the world love that kind of media that just loves to hammer out all the dirty details and destroy people's lives based on innuendo. It's really dangerous. There should be laws against that. There should be laws that prohibit the media from interfering in the personal, private lives of people until there is actual evidence, proven evidence in court, evidence proven that somebody's committed a crime. The purpose of the media, the news media, should not be to, in a sense, become a substitution for a jury, for a judge and a jury. Nothing should substitute an actual judge and a jury, because that's just wrong. And that's what the mass media does. they suddenly make, they give the impression of, like there was a man here in the UK, in Britain, in England, who was suspected of having murdered a young lady. And it turned out he was innocent. But he had his life turned upside down in the most horrific way because a major chain of newspapers and other so-called mass media, mess media as I call them, decided to profit off that person's suspectability. That's just wrong. Newspapers, mass media have responsibility towards society. Now, if they're just phony mass media, then they should admit that. They should say at the front of each edition of their newspaper, we're not a real newspaper. We like to feed off all kinds of innuendo, unproven allegations. In that case, that's not a serious newspaper, and that's the problem. The majority of people, tend to confuse these terrible pseudo newspapers, these fake news organizations, with real ones. And that just is very dangerous because, well, we see the evidence of it. It destroys lives. So conflict profiteers love to feed off the personal, private details of people, especially people whose politics they disagree with. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about conflict profiteers. Think about it. Let me know what you think. You may have heard all of this already, but I think it's something we should discuss on a regular basis, because until our world is free from all these unethical violations of human rights, we're in big trouble.